Hi, my name is Barney Salzberg. I am an author. I write stories. I am an illustrator. I draw pictures. I also write and I sing songs, and I play the guitar. I've written close to 50 books for children, and I thought it might be fun to read a few of my stories as a podcast. So welcome to my first. And the first story I'm going to read you is a book I wrote called Mrs. Morgan's Lawn. And I grew up in Los Angeles, and I had a neighbor who lived next door, whose name was not Mrs. Morgan. But when I was playing and my ball rolled onto her lawn, she would come outside and take it. We were not friends. So as an adult, when I started writing books, I decided that that would be an interesting story to explore. It's changed a bit in the book, but it's based on a true story. So this is Mrs. Morgan's Lawn. I'll explain the pictures because you can't see them, but I'm hoping you can imagine them in your head while I tell the story. Mrs. Morgan's Lawn. Every time a ball lands on Mrs. Morgan's lawn, she keeps it. Somewhere inside her house must be a closet full of balls. What could she do with all of them? The boy is imagining Mrs. Morgan dressed up as a witch. She's cooking the balls in a giant cauldron, which is like a big pot that a witch would use. There's a fire underneath it, and Mrs. Morgan is reading a book under the moon that says Great Ball Recipes. Mrs. Morgan doesn't want anything touching her lawn. She waits for leaves to fall so she can catch them before they land. My parents would say that's how some people are, and the boy is imagining Mrs. Morgan with a butterfly net catching leaves. Mrs. Morgan would keep her lawn inside her house if she could, and now he's imagining her in her bathrobe with a lawnmower in her living room mowing the grass, which kind of looks like a green carpet. Mrs. Morgan moved her mailbox out by the sidewalk. I'm sure she's afraid the mail carrier might step on her lawn. I know my parents would say that's how some people are, but I think some people are weird. Last fall, we were playing with my brand new purple and white soccer ball. The score was 5-3 when the worst possible thing happened. Philippe kicked the ball right over Renee's head. Guess where it landed? That's right, Mrs. Morgan's lawn. And she came outside and took the ball and went back inside. If that's how some people are, then some people are mean. I bet Mrs. Morgan was born mean, and he's now imagining Mrs. Morgan as a baby in a stroller with a teddy bear. But she tore the head off the teddy bear, and all the stuffing from inside the stuffed animal is dropping onto the sidewalk. I told my parents I lost my new purple and white soccer ball. I said I wished Mrs. Morgan would take her lawn and move somewhere else. My father suggested I speak with Mrs. Morgan and ask her to give me back my soccer ball. I figured there must be an easier way to get the ball back. And he's imagining Mrs. Morgan leaving, and she's driving a truck. And on the back of the truck is her lawn. So he thought if I would call Mrs. Morgan and tell her I was from a radio station that was having a contest to see who had the most soccer balls, footballs, and tennis balls and baseballs, I would tell her to put them all in a box on her front porch so the station's official counters could stop by and count them. That's an interesting idea. Or what if I hid inside a giant ball and rolled onto Mrs. Morgan's lawn? She would take me inside, and I would find out where the rest of the balls were. Then I would wait until she went to sleep and take all the balls back. I think it's a great idea, but I think it would be really hard to find a ball you could get inside. So I tried to think of a game that I would like that didn't need a ball. I decided to speak to Mrs. Morgan. And he's walking over to her house with his hands in his pocket, looking a little nervous. I would be, too, if I was going over there. When he got to her house, Mrs. Morgan was wearing a blanket over her head. Mrs. Morgan had a bad cold. I told her that I was sorry and that I had tried to be careful and that it had been an accident every time my ball landed on her lawn. I told her that her lawn had taken all of my green glow-in-the-dark tennis balls, plus the professional leather football I got for my birthday, plus 4 brand new baseballs, and finally my favorite purple and white soccer ball. She acted like she didn't know what I was talking about. All she said was to make sure I didn't step on her lawn on my way out. And Mrs. Morgan was standing in her doorway with the blanket over her head, watching as the boy walked home. My parents said they were proud of me for speaking up. I couldn't understand why. I didn't get any of the balls back. I said I wished Mrs. Morgan would disappear. The next morning, Mrs. Morgan wasn't outside. I guess she still had a bad cold, and something was different about her lawn. And she is still inside the house. You can see her in the window with the blanket on her head. And for the very first time, the lawn that Mrs. Morgan has taken such good care of has leaves on it. She would never have left leaves stay on her lawn. When my ball rolled onto Mrs. Morgan's lawn, nothing happened. It just sat there. I could actually play without worrying about losing my ball. It was great. After a few days, I knew that something wasn't right. Mrs. Morgan would never want her lawn looking so bad, and she's still in the window. She still has a blanket over her head, but there's a lot of leaves on her lawn for the very first time. The leaves piled so high that it looked like just a leaf lawn. I spent my afternoons hunting for my ball when it rolled onto her lawn because the leaves had piled so high. I decided to rake the leaves, and Mrs. Morgan is upstairs in her house looking out the window as the boy is raking the leaves. The next day, Mrs. Morgan was back outside. She must have felt better. My entire ball collection was on my front lawn, except for my new purple and white soccer ball. I thanked Mrs. Morgan for returning my collection and asked if she'd forgotten my purple and white soccer ball. Mrs. Morgan kept raking. She acted as if she couldn't hear me. My parents would say that's how some people are. And I say some people are full of surprises. And Mrs. Morgan took the purple and white soccer ball out from the trash can that had a bunch of leaves in it, and she kicked it back to the boy. She kicked it so hard her hat fell off, and I think he was surprised. And that is the end of Mrs. Morgan's lawn. I hope you liked the story, and I hope to add more as the weeks go on.
Just one more
Thanks.
story. I promise to go to sleep after it ends. Tell me just one more story about Billy and Nibley, two very best friends.
And Billy hopped onto his bed, got under the covers, and a few moments later, Nibley came jumping right up next to him and got under the covers. And a few moments later, they were both fast asleep.